Hello and welcome to my YouTube channel once again. Today we have the Turpin family case back, and I say back because I did this case years ago, when I was just starting out, and when it became known. So today we bring the update with everything that happened during these years, and also, let's say, the complete story of what would really be the horror of the Turpin's house. On the screen, you can see the rest of my cases. Below are my social networks if you'd like to follow me on any of them. And with nothing else to say, let's begin. So let's start from the beginning. Who were the Turpins? The parents of the family were the married couple David Allen Turpin and Louise Anna Robinette Turpin. Together, they had the incredible number of 13 children. The identities of most of these 13 people are still kept anonymous. But today, we will mention two of the sisters from this family who are of great relevance to the case. These are Jennifer and Jordan Turpin. Before we continue with the case, let's look at a bit of the history prior to the marriage. David Allen Turpin was born on October 17, 1961 in West Virginia, United States. Not much is known about his childhood or early life. His parents were Betty and James Turpin, and he has a brother named Randy Turpin. He was what was considered a nerd at that time. He wasn't very popular, he was shy, he didn't have many friends, and of course he liked computers and the technology of that time. After graduating from high school, Rudd began attending Virginia Tech, where he received a degree in computer engineering. David Turpin's history with religion, machismo, and all his ideology came from much earlier in his family. One of the biggest role models was, in fact, his grandfather, Reverend King Turpin Jr. Actually, and as a detail, one of David's brothers wrote a biography about their grandfather, Reverend King, titled A Man Called King, The Life and Legacy of King Turpin Jr., because it is clear that he was appreciated as someone whose life future generations should follow. I didn't buy the book, and I'm not going to. It's on Amazon, and this is the description in case you want to know. What difference can one life make? As a cotton factory worker in Knoxville, as a miner in Kentucky, Arizona, and West Virginia, and as a farmer-miner preacher in the Appalachian Mountain region. It's a story filled with amazing incidents of faith amidst difficulties and dramatic manifestations of God's power amidst impossibilities. The story of King Turpin Jr. demonstrates the meaning of a life dedicated to God. Although this book was written as a tribute to King Turpin, with the intention of inspiring faith in God, it also contains valuable information for researchers exploring the culture of the Appalachians and the history of other Turpins from East Tennessee. This already gives us an idea that, evidently, religion was a big part of the Turpins' life. For them, King Turpin Jr. was a great example of what they should do. And in reality, this man's life was not so much an example to follow, but rather a warning of what awaited the rest of the Turpins. First of all, David's grandfather, Reverend King Turpin Jr., had fallen in love with a 16-year-old girl, almost half his age. At that time, the taste for underage girls seemed to run in the family. Just 2 months after Nellie, the mother of his 8 children, died giving birth. King Turpin Jr. married his children's nurse, a woman named Bertha Lee Church, the 16-year-old girl. It turns out that the day before Christmas of 1932, he made a deal with Bertha's father. The deal was to exchange her for a car, the Studebaker Big Six. And yes, Bertha's father traded her for a car and let her marry someone twice her age. Over the next 18 years, Bertha would give him 11 more children, for a total of 19, although sadly, 5 of them died in infancy. Going further back, we see abuse and reprehensible behaviors in this man's upbringing. The father, King Turpin Sr., was a very strict man. He would chase King Jr. and his younger sister Minnie, around the house with a hot poker or throwing stones at them. When caught, he would brutally beat them. On one occasion, as punishment, he took away their only pairs of shoes, forcing them to walk barefoot. He would return them on Sundays for church so the neighbors wouldn't talk. But at that moment, as soon as they got home again, he confiscated the shoes again for another week, saying they could wear them when they learned to behave. King Turpin Sr. used to leave his 2 young children alone at home for weeks, while he looked for some work to support the family. That is, basically, the children lived alone. On one occasion, after a particularly violent beating, he and his sister decided to run away from their father. A family friend took them in and then called King Sr., who came to pick them up. In 1915, when King was 12, Tennessee Social Services authorities intervened. They found that the 2 Turpin children had been severely neglected and placed them in separate orphanages. That is, this abuse of the youngest has always been there. Generations of Turpin children being mistreated. This time it was just 2 brothers. Now we have a case of 13 abused children. Clearly, David Turpin, the father at the center of this story, was no exception when it came to abusing and being abused. So, going back to him, in the year 1985, David gets to know Louise Robinette more directly. At that time, she was just 16 years old, 6 years younger than Turpin. And I say he got to know her officially again, because it seems they knew each other from much earlier, because their families were friends through the church. Turpin had already seen her several times, had held her when she was still a baby, and when he saw her again at 10 years old, he first knew he was attracted to her. That's why, when they got together, when she was 16 years old, he knew they had to get married. But it wasn't that David wanted to wait until she was of age, but that he wanted to get married at that very moment. Robinette came from a Christian family, as was the Turpin family. Despite the age difference and the fact that she was still underage, Robinette's parents gave their consent for Turpin and her to get married. And so they did that same year. Louise Anna Turpin was born on May 24, 1968. She had 6 siblings and was the daughter of a pastor, something that clearly marked her life, but at a somewhat unhealthy level in this case. During the trial, which took place years later, some details about Louise's life were revealed, showing a tough childhood, and I mean something very similar to what she would make her children experience later on. Remember that we are not here to justify those guilty of such crimes, but to understand how they came to have the slightest idea of how to be so horrible. According to her sister, everything she did to her children originated in her youth. Due to the abuse she was subjected to by her own family, she came to hate her parents, Wayne and Phyllis, so much that when they died in 2016, she didn't even go to their funerals. Phyllis, the mother of Louise, in turn was the first to suffer abuse, which Turpin passed on to his daughters. Phyllis was tired of having to take care of her daughters, so Louise soon had to take care of his younger sister, Elizabeth. Little Elizabeth watched as her parents constantly fought, while Louise tried to protect her from the yelling and the consequences of their fights. Louise's childhood was more than anything abuse, in every possible way, and for some reason, she was the favorite among her sisters. Whom to hurt. Phyllis usually left Louise with her father, the girl's grandfather, John Taylor. He, Taylor, abused his daughter, Phyllis, all his life. She was aware of what she had suffered, and yet did not hesitate to leave another possible victim in his care. Even more so because by leaving Louise with her grandfather to abuse her, she also received money. Every time they needed money, Phyllis would turn to him. Phyllis's daughters begged not to be taken to their grandfather's house, but no one listened to them. Whenever asked why they had to go, Phyllis would say they must do these things to support themselves, eat, and have clothes. Louise was very protective of her sisters and tried to defend them, sacrificing herself in the process. At school, Louise was the vice president of the Bible Club and was constantly bullied by her peers. She hoped her life would change for the better. Marrying David Turpin, she thought he would be a successful engineer, and they would live happily with their future. 12 children. And yes, they planned from the beginning to have 12 children. They finally had 13. They also considered that by the time she met David Turpin again and had this idea of staying with him. Her grandfather had divorced, and thus the sexual abuse towards his granddaughters had become much worse. Elizabeth, one of Louise's sisters, thinks that at that time she was desperate to escape. Phyllis would take her 3 daughters to John Taylor's new home, regularly allowing her father to abuse them and then continue taking the money. Every time Taylor asked one of Louise's sisters for a strong hug, as he called touching them, Louise insisted on taking their place. When their grandmother, Taylor's previous wife, discovered that Phyllis was still allowing him to abuse her daughters, she demanded that she stop taking care of them. But Phyllis would always reply that he was their father. That was her entire response. The Turpins' beliefs were always present in their lifestyle and in the actions they took. Like, for instance, the fact that they were supposed to remain virgins until marriage, and that sexual relations should only be for the purpose of procreation. Thanks to his studies, Turpin landed a very well-paid job as an engineer for a company in Texas. So, along with his wife, they moved to Fort Worth, a city of people with a high standard of living. This happened in the late 80s. And so it was that soon David and Louise Turpin began to have children. The first of all was Jennifer, who was born in the year 1988. Then, over the following years, they had children one after another until they reached a total of 13. The last of them was born in the year 2015, and in total, there were 10 females and 3 males. At the beginning of the marriage, David was making a lot of money in his new job at General Dynamics, and he fulfilled his promise that they would live well. And on the other hand, although Louise still sent letters to Elizabeth regularly, he wanted to cut ties with his family and childhood acquaintances. He wanted to disassociate from his miserable childhood, blaming his family for his grandfather's sexual abuse. Without Louise, his parents' arguments got even worse. 8-year-old Elizabeth and her 3-year-old sister, Teresa, would hug each other to try to escape from the constant fights without their older sister. To protect them, Elizabeth and Teresa had to endure their grandfather's despicable behavior alone. Beyond Louise's family, in the early years, the new Turpin family lived well, spending on outings and expensive restaurants. Sometime later, Phyllis, Louise's mother, separated, got a new partner, had another child, and her new partner. At some point, she died, so she suddenly found herself desperate for some money and had to start prostituting herself. That's how she started leaving her daughters alone at home to take care of themselves. Incredibly, out of the 3 sisters, Louise ended up being the one who tortured her children, her own children, in the same way they did to her and her sisters. It sounds strange that she wanted to protect them, but then she just went on to physically and psychologically abuse her children. But that's what happened. In the fall of 1987, Louise Turpin became pregnant. She and David were thrilled. They were finally starting the big family they wanted so much. On July 28th, Louise gave birth to a girl whom they named Jennifer Dunn. Over the next few weeks, Louise would send a series of photos of her and David posing with their little daughter at Disneyland and other picturesque places in Southern California. Their lives seemed perfect. That Christmas, as he had previously promised, Louise paid for his mother and sisters to go to California and finally meet his new baby. Teresa remembers that the family's house was very clean and well kept at that time. Over the next 3 weeks, the Robinettes stayed with the Turpins and went on lavish trips to Disney, Universal Studios, and the Movieland Wax Museum. On February 3, 1992, Louise Turpin gave birth to a boy. His name was Joshua David. From then on, all of their babies' names would start with the letter J. Shortly after Joshua's birth, David and Louise declared bankruptcy. Despite David's high salary, the couple had been living beyond their means and had maxed out their credit cards, accumulating a large debt. Louise had also recently discovered a passion for gambling and had been losing a lot. but she never admitted any financial problems to her family, always pretending that everything was fine. As more children were born, they had less money, and anyway, they didn't say anything. They maintained the facade of affording an expensive lifestyle. The first to realize that something was going on was Elizabeth. In those years, she was studying at Lee University in Cleveland, Tennessee, and asked, before starting the holidays, if she could spend the summer with them in Fort Worth. David and Louise agreed. When they picked her up and while they were driving through Louisiana all three together, David suddenly, and to Elizabeth's surprise, took another exit off the interstate, one she didn't know. Louise announced they would go to a casino to gamble and asked Elizabeth to take care of the kids while they were out. But first, he made his sister promise that she would never tell anyone in the family that they gambled, as it went against their religious beliefs. A few hours later, while the kids were sleeping in the back of the van in the casino's garage, David returned. He seemed very upset and complained that Louise had a serious gambling problem and refused to stop, even though he was losing a lot. After complaining for a while, he went back to the casino saying he hoped they had enough money for fuel to get to Fort Worth. They spent several more hours waiting in the casino's garage with the kids before David took Louise back to the car. They had obviously been arguing. That was already a pretty strange start, which should have warned Elizabeth that staying with them would be a bad idea. However, one also has to ask where else she would go, so she stayed with them over the summer. When Elizabeth finally moved into the Turpins' house, she was initially thrilled to reunite with Louise. They enjoyed spending time together, but Elizabeth soon realized how strict Louise and David were with their young children, especially, and for some reason, with Jennifer. She noticed that the children had to ask for permission to go to the bathroom and also to eat. Elizabeth never saw her sister or brother-in-law show affection or tenderness towards their children. During the summer, Elizabeth never saw them kiss their children or even hug them. They were not good with either their older children or their baby, who clearly required a lot of attention. Elizabeth was also puzzled by the meals. Louise had turned them into a kind of strange ritual. After placing the food plates on the table, he would call the children to eat one at a time. And for some reason, Louise was always harder on Jennifer than any of the others. Before she was allowed to eat, the girl had to look her mother in the eyes and smile, and then wait for her to return the smile, allowing her to eat. At last, after Jennifer finished eating, her mother would tell her to stand up and smile before sending her back to her room. Jennifer and her 3 siblings were confined to their rooms for long periods of time and were never allowed out that summer. No contact with her aunt. Unless Louise was present, Elizabeth said she didn't want her talking to the kids. Louise told Elizabeth it was to protect their children, as he didn't want her beliefs to rub off on them. Although she felt uncomfortable with the way David and Louise treated their children, the young woman, who was 19 at the time, never challenged them. Elizabeth also noticed they both had a bad temper. For example, David would get furious at the slightest provocation. David would get upset every time Louise did something that in his eyes was wrong or he simply did not like. He would get very angry. When Elizabeth lived there, he wouldn't allow them to do anything together without him. According to Rick Ross, a cult expert and founder of the Cult Education Institute, it was in Fort Worth where David Turpin began to shape his family into this cult. Using his distorted version of Pentecostal teachings as a base, he saw himself as a charismatic leader, with Louise as his second in command. Over the next years, as their family expanded, David and Louise introduced a set of elaborate rules and punishments, conditioning their children to absolute obedience and dependence. The children, moreover, had to call them mother and father, no other way. Elizabeth said they slowly drifted away from their church. They had begun to acquire certain beliefs from other religions, thus creating a new one specifically for them. Anyway, they also excused certain behaviors that we will see later, such as behaviors that the Bible spoke of and, therefore, according to them, they should respect. With this, they also escaped for a good time from the criticisms towards their teachings, since it was part of their religion, and they followed what the Bible said. Moreover, during her stay, Elizabeth felt her relationship with her sister was becoming increasingly distant. Shortly after moving to Fort Worth, Elizabeth found a summer job at a local store. Louise insisted on taking her to and from work, establishing a strict set of rules for her to follow. She was not allowed to have friends, use the home phone, or tell anyone where she lived. It seemed like they were trying to add her to their little sect. Louise was making it clear to her that if she broke any of his rules, she would not be able to return home. That same summer, Elizabeth closely observed David and Louise, learning the dynamics of their relationship. On the outside, her sister seemed to be in control and making all the decisions, while David quietly watched with his arms crossed, but Louise always looked to him for affirmation. Elizabeth said it was Louise who would decide whether or not to punish the children for any violation of their set of rules. But it was David who carried out such punishments. Elizabeth was also feeling uncomfortable with her brother-in-law's increasingly inappropriate behavior, such as making strange jokes and comments. One day in the kitchen, David and Louise discussed their relationship. David admitted to having been infatuated with his sister since Louise was 10 years old, when he had started making advances towards her. Do you remember what? Did they meet when he was 10 years old? He felt a slight attraction to Louise even then. After this situation, which was already seeming out of place, something even worse and even more out of place happened. Elizabeth was showering when Louise forced the bathroom lock with a hanger. Then she and David came in to look. They entered the bathroom, saw her showering, and even coming out to dry off with both of them still there. It seems this was part of the made-up rules for their house. As she shyly dried off, they began to laugh at her embarrassment. They also tried to pretend it was a joke, as if they weren't doing anything wrong. From then on, David and Louise often watched Elizabeth in the shower and told her she was beautiful, even though Elizabeth hated it. The truth is that she had no alternative. However, she insisted that David never laid a finger on her. She also said in the same interview that she never saw them abuse their children. Maybe she wanted to defend her sister, or she really didn't notice. But everything she described and what I've been telling you about her testimony, her time with them, what she witnessed was abuse. By the end of the summer, Louise discovered that his sister had become friends with a coworker and that she regularly had lunch with him. She got very angry, and after dropping Elizabeth off at work one day, she never picked her up again. Elizabeth was desperate that day and kept calling Louise, who refused to answer the phone. She spent the night sleeping on a bench at a nearby Walmart. For the next 3 nights, Elizabeth slept outside and went to work in the same clothes. Finally, Louise answered the phone and told his sister to go back to Tennessee. It was only after Elizabeth threatened to call the police that Louise allowed her to come back and pick up her things. Teresa, the other sister that Louise had left behind on his own, had also come to visit the family. And there she could see some things that seemed strange to her. For example, she could notice in Jennifer that she smelled bad and always wore the same clothes. But the curious and most striking thing was that she always wore the same clothes. But in the wardrobe, there were more new pieces, things that were unused, which, by the way, no longer fit her, due to the amount of time they had been there. But they even had the tags on, and it was very expensive clothing. Jennifer's classmates also noticed things. One of her classmates said that Jennifer smelled of urine and dirt, but something that became much more important were her attitudes. The same classmate also said that Jennifer used to touch her private areas in public. She thought at that moment that it seemed like she was scratching, and maybe it was because of how dirty she was. However, those are or could be signs of sexual abuse. At that time, Jennifer was 9 years old. Incredibly, even though the school knew about this, nothing seems to have happened as a result. One day, according to another classmate, the class mocked Jennifer when a teacher ordered her to remove an old bar wrapper. Hershey, like the Hershey candy, the chocolate, which she was using as a hair tie to tie it up. It's clear that part of taking the Turpin siblings out of school was to make sure the abuse and neglect they were suffering wasn't as noticeable. Because even though nothing was being done at the time, little by little, more adults could start to realize. By then, the family was already going through Chapter 7 of bankruptcy and, incidentally, scamming the banks of their credit cards. But why were they declaring bankruptcy? Chapter 7 is designed for debtors who can't pay their existing debts as joint debtors. Louise and David Turpin would have to undergo a means test to determine if they were eligible to have their debts canceled and thus be able to start over. They would also be allowed to keep cars and other properties considered exempt, according to the United States bankruptcy law. If it went well, they would have kept all their things, practically without spending anything, and the debts they had on their credit cards would disappear. So for 1999, their children. Until then, 6 did not go to school and were educated by Louise, who left high school at 16 years old to get married. But in addition, they had been kicked out of their house because of all the unpaid debts. Anyway, that was just the beginning of the nightmare, because the more children they had, the worse the situation became. The reality that the Turpin brothers were living was something that others could not see or did not want to. For nearly 30 years, the Turpins put their children through a real hell. The first ones were lucky, so to speak, to have a bit of freedom in their early years of life. And by freedom, I mean they were able to attend school for a few years. But starting from 1993, the couple pulled everyone out of schools and started a homeschooling plan. From here on, the Turpin children were rarely able to leave their home. They were usually locked in the basement or in their rooms and were not allowed to leave or talk to anyone else. If any of them disobeyed their parents, they were chained to their bed. This was not even a small percentage of all the things their parents did to them. The malnutrition they suffered was truly unbelievable. Hopefully, they would prepare food for them so they could at least have one meal a day each, and the quality of this food they were given was very poor. In general, it was junk food, like sausages or leftovers from fast food. That is, they bought food for themselves, the parents. But what was left over was some McDonald's fries. They gave their children some hamburgers. That was the food they provided them. The hygiene of the children, and the house in general, was deplorable. They weren't allowed to bathe more than once or twice a year. While the house accumulated a large amount of garbage, used diapers, food scraps of everything you can imagine, and there were even animal carcasses inside the house. One would then clearly think, after hearing all this, how is it possible that they did all that without anyone noticing? The truth is, it's hard to imagine how no neighbor or family member ever noticed how the Turpins treated their children. But the reality is that David and Louise Turpin didn't socialize much with their neighbors. They barely spoke to them. They very rarely appeared in public, and those few times they did, they put on a real charade of a happy family. On the internet, you can find several photos that David and Louise themselves posted where the family was seen in places like Disneyland, a place that, incidentally, was a favorite of both David and Louise. Another reason, perhaps why the Turpins were not discovered, was that they generated a bit of fear, as they were very mysterious people. And also, David was a gun enthusiast and used to tell people that he had guns. So perhaps the neighbors, to avoid problems with them, simply ignored them, even though they suspected that something might be wrong. In addition, the last 5 years before the case was discovered, the Turpin parents did not let their children see the rest of the family. For example, David's mother and the young people's grandmother had not been able to see them during all that time. In this way, they made sure not to raise suspicions. So, if one did not pay much attention and only saw the posts they uploaded, they could fall into the deception that they were a large, happy family. But the occasions on which they staged these simulations were really scarce. In reality, they didn't allow their children to have any contact with the outside world. Even when they staged these simulations and went somewhere, they were told that they were absolutely forbidden to talk to other people. And they threatened them that if they told anyone anything, social services would take them away and send them all to other countries, which obviously they wouldn't be able to know if it was true or false, because since they didn't talk to anyone, they didn't go to school, and the only education they received was from their parents. They had nothing to compare this information with. In the early 2000s, the family moved from Fort Worth to Rio Vista, also in Texas. In this place, they got a slightly larger house, but the living conditions of the children were the same as always. And as the weeks went by, the new house turned into a real dump. Again, starting from 2007, David bought a trailer, a caravan, a mobile home, or whatever you call it, and sent most of his children to live there. The conditions were the same, only now they lived outside the main property. The only ones who lived inside the house were the two youngest, who were just babies. In 2010, the family relocated to California. The curious thing is that the neighbors from Rio Vista checked the house once the Torpings moved out and found everything I mentioned before. Mountains of piled-up trash, used diapers, and dead animals. Incredibly, this didn't set off any alarms that something could be wrong with that family. Let me go into a bit more detail on this, because it's important. When they entered the property, the neighbors first freed the dogs that were still inside. Even though the family had already left, they found the following. All the carpet had been ripped out, and the floors were covered in feces and urine. Apparently, the dogs had survived by eating dirty diapers and drinking from the toilets. When they entered the bedroom, the smell that was there became unbearable. It was set up like a barracks with 6 bunk beds stacked in a row. None of the beds had a mattress, but one of the neighbors noticed ropes tied to some of the headboards. The neighbors had no idea what those ropes were for, so it didn't cause them any concern. The living room looked like it had been used as an improvised classroom, with 8 small desks and educational posters stuck on the walls. There was also a broken blackboard. Scattered on the floor were a series of religious pamphlets and books. Once outside, they decided to go check out the trailer. As they walked through the trailer, they noticed that all the doors, cabinets, toy chests, and even the refrigerator shared a certain characteristic. Everything, the refrigerator too, everything was locked with a padlock. Then they passed by the Turpin's abandoned old Ford van, which had been used as a garbage dump, and it was full of cans of sausages, canned meat, and diapers. All of this had been there so long that the bags had rotted and the garbage was actually falling out, and the bugs would come in and eat from there. The back Porsche door of the house was open, so they went in, and the smell there was also overwhelming. One of the neighbors said they were knee-deep in filth. That is, the stacked dirty diapers reached up to their waist. There were computers, toys, and trash. The toys were still in the boxes unused. They had never been opened. They had Mattel toys for the baby and Pirates of the Caribbean stuff, as well as a television. You could see the rats jumping in and out of the stuff. In the kitchen, they found a dead cat on the stove and a dead dog on the floor, as well as several carcasses of other animals scattered around. There, at that moment, is when they decided to run away from the place. The years went by, and the Turpin's conditions were getting worse and worse. On several occasions, some tried to escape, but they didn't get very far, as they were overwhelmed by the sight of the outside world. They couldn't handle themselves and returned home. In 2011, another drill I mentioned occurred, and it's that David and Louise decided to renew their vows in a most bizarre and strange party. The ceremony was officiated by an Elvis impersonator, and all the brothers participated. All of this was recorded on video, where you can appreciate the bizarre ceremony and the strange behavior of the children, who, by the way, were all dressed alike. This was something that David and Louise forced them to do, dressing all the girls the same and the boys as well. It was almost as if they were uniforms. In total, they renewed their vows and posted it online 3 times, in 2011, 2013, and 2015. Always, of course, pretending to be something they were not, a good and united family. David and Louise created a bubble around their children, controlling every aspect of their lives. David reigned like a god, introducing a set of strict rules by which they had to live or suffer the terrible consequences. With the help of Louise, he brainwashed them to fear the outside world, so they would never try to escape. They ordered their children to never tell anyone their names or talk about what was happening inside the house, as it would contaminate the family. According to them, clearly, the rules that the parents made up, supposedly for religious reasons, did not follow the teachings of any religion. Among these, for example, was the one about water. Remember that they did not let them bathe, so if they saw that their children had washed their hands above the wrist, That was considered playing with water, and they were punished, being chained. They had, in any case, more than religious a sectarian behavior, even going so far as to call their children with religious names, most of them starting with the letter J, as you may have already noticed. At some point, after moving into the mobile home, and before the brothers even thought about escaping, mother and father, as the children had to call them, abandoned their children for 4 years. They found an apartment to the south, in Benbrook, Texas, and took Jalissa and Yolinda with them. Jennifer and Joshua were left in charge of their 8 younger siblings. Every few days, David would come to the trailer to bring them some frozen food, but Louise never visited them. In those 4 years, no. He didn't want to see them. During the following years, the children lived in terrible conditions in the trailer, which was filled with feces and garbage. Under the orders of the parents, the children were still forbidden to wash their hands above the wrists. Their pets defecated inside the trailer. There was also no medical treatment for any of the children. If they got hurt, Jonathan still has 3 scars on his head from living in bus. The trailer was cramped, with no room to move around without bumping into furniture. Even though at that time they lived an hour away by car, their parents still completely controlled the children by phone. Joshua was ordered to change diapers, and Jennifer was in charge of preparing basic meals for her siblings. The 2 eldest children were also instructed to punish any of their brothers and sisters who broke their parents' rules, locking them in cages. Clearly, they were also under threats that, if they did not comply with what they were told, they would be punished and locked up. You may then ask, how did they do that if they weren't even close to them? Consider that by that time, after the year 2006, the children had years of conditioning. All they knew was that life, their parents and siblings, not much more. Even those lucky enough to attend school couldn't do much, especially if they had the slightest idea of escaping. Knowing that something was not right, didn't they want to leave their siblings with those parents? Moreover, clearly, like a cult, the children had been forced to spy on each other to be rewarded, or rather, to avoid being punished. Jennifer managed to escape from her house by running through the woods, searching for a neighbor who could take her away. Someone took her to the city, where the young woman frantically tried to get a job, asking not only how she could find employment, but also an apartment and a car. Clearly, no one accepted her. She had no form of identification or driver's license. There was nothing they could do for her in that situation. With nothing else to do, she called her mother, who picked her up and took her away. Over the years, Louise and David changed religions several times, exploring Catholicism, Mormonism, and even trying to understand the Mennonites. They also practiced witchcraft and used Ouija boards to contact spirits. Louise had also started drinking alcohol, and the couple decided to have an open relationship. All things that went against the religion they had grown up with. The only good thing they did at that time was on Louise David's part. He had a job, and even though they kept creating debts with their multiple cards, they also had some money for themselves, which managed to satisfy their lifestyle. So Louise decided to help his sister Elizabeth while she was separating from her husband. She hired him a lawyer, and perhaps the most surprising thing is that she also bought him a house. Although by 2010, David Turpin lost his job and had to face the tremendous amount of debt in his name. Still working on another bankruptcy filing, they managed to avoid many things, moving from place to place, renting, and still pretending to live a perfect life. Inside, the children lived in fear, surrounded by filth, and to top it off, they weren't taught anything. Louise gave them a few lessons a year until he got tired and lost interest. To make matters worse, the children couldn't talk to anyone, so they grew up with just a few basic knowledge. And to ensure that the Riverside County authorities never questioned why none of the Turpin children attended school, David Turpin officially opened the City Day School and appointed himself as principal. On October 1, 2010, he submitted the California Department of Education's private school affidavit. He wrote that his City Day School, at 39,950 St. Honor Drive, in Murrieta, had 8 students from 2nd to 11th grade. Under the religious column, he wrote that it would not be affiliated with any denomination, he wrote, This is a full-time private school offering instruction in various branches of study required to be taught in state public schools. That offer this instruction in English, and that keeps attendance records. All of this in the sworn statement was basically lying. From that moment on, these parents officially educated their children at home, with no legal obligation to send them to public school. Educating them anyway seems like a very strong word in this context, because they really didn't do anything like it. Because the city day school had more than 6 students. It was subject to an annual inspection by the local fire chief to ensure it met safety and fire standards. But during the next 7 years that David Turpin ran his private school, there was never any inspection. After moving to this new place, to Morietta, the abuse of their children by Louise and David intensified. Instead of being a new beginning, the house in Morietta became their new prison. The parents confined their children to different rooms and began to tie them to furniture with ropes as punishment. But David and Louise treated the older siblings better than the younger ones. Much better, perhaps trying to generate resentment and jealousy among the children. Joshua, for his part, got a camera, and Jennifer was even allowed to have a smartphone. The parents were sure that their control was strong enough that the siblings would never try to use these limited luxuries to escape. Luis re-entered his children's lives after his radical midlife crisis, which I didn't tell you about. She had a little crisis after turning 40, in which she started spending a lot on herself. There was a makeover, and upon opening up the relationship, she had her husband take her to different hotels to have sex with men. This included her unwillingness to see her children. Her sister believes all of this was a regression to her adolescence. Somewhere along the line, getting into things she couldn't do at that stage of her life. But now it was in a slightly more perverse way, so to speak. It was also during that time that she told them she tried alcohol for the first time, something her religion didn't allow. The prosecutors in the case said that after she returned from this midlife crisis, she seemed to take on the role of dominant physical abuser. She always appeared angry, frightening all the children. She only let them leave their rooms for the bathroom, meals, and teeth brushing. Exercise was prohibited. Jordan would later tell the police that in Murrieta, they spent 20 hours a day in their rooms, waking up around 11 p.m., and then they would go back to bed at 3 a.m. The rest of the time they slept, they were fed minimally at a specific schedule and had no access to televisions, radios, or newspapers, leaving them without understanding of the outside world. Still, for some reason, the parents told them to keep a record of what they did in their diaries. They had personal diaries that would later also help to solve what happened in this case. To see what really happened to these children inside the house, by the year 2015, the idea began to take shape in the older siblings that everything that was happening was very wrong and that they had to flee from there. The ages of the 3 Turpin siblings ranged from 2 years to 29. One of the main characters in all of this was Jordan Turpin, who at that time was entering adolescence. While they were all isolated from the outside world and were not allowed to go out, they were allowed, on rare occasions, access to television and the internet. According to her own testimony, Jordan was able to learn a little more about the outside world thanks to television series, mainly from Disney Channel. She also managed to get a broken cell phone that couldn't make calls, but could access the internet and take pictures. She didn't know much about how to use it, but she gradually learned. She started watching videos on YouTube and became a fan of. By watching Justin Bieber's interviews, she learned more about the outside world. And at that moment then, she was already determined to escape. That's how we get to a few years later, on January 14th, 2018. Jordan, who was 17 years old at that time, took advantage of her parents leaving the house for a moment and escaped. Once she was far enough away, she used her phone, which had no service, to call 911. Remember that even if a phone doesn't have a chip, it can usually make calls to 911, that is, to emergencies. At least it has to be able to call. During her conversation then, with this line, Jordan tried to explain to the operator everything that was going on. Even so, she had trouble communicating. There were many words whose meaning she didn't know. However, she managed to tell the operator what was happening. And look, I'm going to play the audio, and you guys decide. If this doesn't seem like a prank call, because of how unusual it may seem, That way, you can put yourself in the shoes of this operator who didn't quite know what to do.
I just ran away from home. Do you know what street you're on? Emily is 15th. We have abuse. Did you hear that? They hit us? They, throw us across the room? Okay.
How old are you?
I'm 17.
He wasn't clearly sure whether it was true or not, but in the moment, while they were talking, he sent a patrol to where he was. This matter of the address, of course, also took a few minutes to decipher, since Jordan didn't know the names of the streets or the direction to his house. But thanks to global positioning system tracking, they were able to locate it. That's when a police officer arrived in a patrol car. Jordan, following the operator's instructions, stood on a corner. Now, Jordan was telling the police officer who saw her there about her entire experience, who initially thought she was just a little girl because of how thin and small she looked. Remember that she was about to turn 18, and because of how she looked, the officer really thought she was no older than 12. And while she was trying to explain what was happening, the policeman didn't believe her. So Jordan showed him on her phone the pictures of her siblings and how they were kept at home, that there were pictures of them chained up. In another, you could also see the large amount of garbage in the house. Now, Mother.
They didn't chain them up just to. They're chained up because they can't. Did they steal the mother's food? I've never spoken to anyone out there, so I've never been alone with the person, so it's very hard for me to talk.
Do you have any medication?
What is the medication? Oh, and it's I don't think I've taken one before.
Do you have pictures of your sisters locked up?
Yes, I don't have proof of everything, but I have proof that my sisters
Are locked up. Your
Parents locked them up? Yes, because they stole the food. I couldn't dial 911 because I'm sorry. I was trying to dial 911. I couldn't even get my thumb to press the buttons because I was shaking so bad. I literally never talked to somebody on the phone. I had to make sure that if I left, we wouldn't go back and we would get the help we needed. Because if we went back, there's no way I would be sitting
Here right now. At that moment then, the police officer knew that it was something serious and called for reinforcements. It was then that a group of police officers approached the Turpin's house to conduct a raid. Due to the possibility of endangered minors being present, they did not need a search warrant. As soon as she heard the knocks on the front door and saw the patrol lights, Louise Turpin immediately ordered the two girls who were being punished at that time to be unchained. 11-year-old Jalissa, who had been chained, later told investigators that when she heard the knocks and saw the flashing lights, she knew Jordan had managed to escape and that they would soon be free. When the front door finally opened, the officers rushed in. Although the smell was overwhelming, nothing had prepared them for the indescribable horrors inside. One of the officers was wearing a body camera recording. So today we have video of what could be seen inside that house. Jonathan Turpin was discovered chained inside a bedroom. As they freed him, he acted as if it was normal. His two younger sisters, who had just been freed, had white stripes on their dirty skin where the chains had been. The other 9 children were scattered throughout the house in narrow rooms, reeking of human excrement. The children were dirty, smelled awful, and looked emaciated. They were asking for food, obviously starving, and as I've been emphasizing, they were filthy. And I'm talking about, the level of abuse had gotten so high. While they were chained up, the Turpin siblings were not allowed to go to the bathroom. They would soil themselves and stay like that, and they only had 1 bath a year. They couldn't bathe at any other time. It was 1 bath a year, and always with dirty clothes. They were only allowed that clothing. The only times they bathed them and took off their clothes and put something nice on them was for photos and, for example, Mother's Day. Nothing more. The last bath they had before being rescued was over 7 months ago. After the raid and finding the Turpin brothers in truly deplorable conditions, David and Louise Turpin were arrested. While the brothers were taken to the hospital, the condition they were in was really critical. The high degree of malnutrition caused them heart problems, poor body development. Even one of the brothers had an arm the diameter of a 4-month-old baby, and in addition, they presented many sequelae, not only physical, but also psychological. For most of them, it was the first time they had seen something like a hospital, and they were really scared of what could happen to them there. When taken out, the children asked for food, but didn't mention or ask about their parents, or express a desire to see them. But I also want them to be aware of what state they were really in. One of the officers described Jordan not only as a girl who seemed to be no more than 10 years old due to the state of her malnourished body, but also he could see how the grime she had was piling up on her matted skin, forming crusts. Speaking in simple sentences and struggling to pronounce the words, Jordan described the torturous life she and her siblings led. She constantly referred to her parents as mother and father and explained that they insisted on being called that, as it was more reminiscent of the Bible days. As I told you in that first video we have, about when they rescue her, when the police arrive and start asking her questions, we can see that she couldn't even express herself well. She was trying to be understood, but clearly she didn't have much experience speaking in the outside world. She was also asked how she had felt during the escape a few hours earlier, and she said she was scared to death, and that it was one of the most terrifying things she had ever done. Jordan said she had escaped because she could no longer bear to see Jalissa and Johanna wake up crying in pain from being chained. She also revealed that her mother had been particularly in a bad mood that morning, yelling at 13-year-old Jolinda and telling her she was worse than the devil. That particularly upset Jordan, who said she was a good Christian. When she heard her mother call her or her sisters the devil, it really bothered her a lot and hurt her, because they all considered themselves lovers of God. That is, they considered themselves good kids and good Christians. Because that's what their parents had taught them, and they obeyed completely. Jordan described her living conditions and her daily routine of spending 20 hours a day in the bedroom she shared with her 3 sisters, never seeing the light of day. She said she slept more than 15 hours a day and couldn't leave her room without her mother's permission. In addition, what the parents used was a tactic to control them, which was not letting them see the sunlight. That is, they only kept them awake during the night. They hardly experienced anything from the outside world. While the brothers were recovering, David and Louis Turpin remained in prison awaiting trial. In total, each faced the following charges against them: 12 charges of torture, 12 charges of unlawful imprisonment, 7 charges of abuse, 6 charges of child abuse, and David received an additional charge for sexual abuse against a minor. Initially, David and Louise pleaded not guilty to all charges, and the trial proceeded. But with the evidence and testimonies against them, finally, as part of a deal, David and Louise pleaded guilty to most of the charges and were both sentenced to life imprisonment, with a minimum of 25 years in prison before they could apply for parole. David and Louise apologized to their children in court after their sentencing, saying, "I never intended for my children to suffer any harm. I'm sorry if I did anything to cause them harm." This was announced by David in court, while Louise said the following: "I hope for the best for my children in the future. I regret everything I have done to hurt my children. I love them very much. I look forward to the day when I can see them, hug them, and tell them I'm sorry. Personally, I hope that day never comes, because I highly doubt that 2 people who have abused their children in this way for years truly feel sorry. Even less should they be allowed to be with the younger ones, who perhaps did not fully understand what was happening. They were also forbidden from seeing their children, so it likely won't be possible. If only we could say that here ended the Turpin brothers' hell and their recovery began. But in recent years, details have come to light that they were not doing well at all. Some of them were able to put their lives back together a bit. Especially the older ones, like Jennifer and Jordan, who managed to start studying a career, make a group of friends, and get a job. But the other siblings, especially the younger ones, went from being victims of their parents to being victims of the United States social system. The siblings were rescued in 2018 and 2022. 6 of them filed a complaint against Riverside County and the private orphanage agency, which was in charge of giving them a new home. But instead, they left them with negligent and abusive people. The siblings reported being sexually, physically, and emotionally abused. The officials in charge of their safety kept the siblings in the foster home for 3 years, despite the fact that they themselves alerted them about the abuse. According to the complaint, the adoptive family allegedly subjected the siblings to severe abuse, including hitting them in the face with sandals, pulling their hair, hitting them with a belt, and hitting them on the head, has been arrested and charged with multiple counts of abuse and neglect, of which the family has pleaded innocent. All of this seems incredible, given that they clearly knew the Turpin siblings' history and knew what kind of home they came from. Leaving them with a family that also mistreated them for no less than 3 years seems like a badly told joke, and in my opinion, they deserve to be reported for not giving them the proper attention, just like the Turpin siblings. They deserve compensation and to live in peace at last. What we can be sure of is that if such negligence happens to them, then it most likely happens to many other children whose stories we do not know. Delving a little deeper into the situation, those in charge of providing a transitional home for the young people were ChildNet, a network that seeks people who want to be adoptive parents. Their description is as follows. The Child Welfare Services network that ChildNet administers is actually a unique local hybrid, built from services backed, managed, and supervised by various entities and funding sources. At the core, controlled more closely and directly by ChildNet, are the fundamental services of the Child Welfare Program, which ChildNet pays for and administers through traditional and formal subcontracts. These subcontracted services include residential programs, reunification and family strengthening programs, family preservation and prevention programs, assessment services, and childcare services. But these that they describe here are the same ones that are now involved in a negligence lawsuit for failing to fulfill their promises. In a statement to People magazine, Brett Lewis, Director of Development and Communications at ChildNet Youth and Family Services, said, "At this time, our organization does not have the freedom to reveal facts or discuss the allegations made in the complaint. We hope to provide the facts at the appropriate time in court. Our agency has been serving California's most vulnerable and traumatized youth for over 50 years. We have a strong track record of providing excellent care and continue to demonstrate our commitment to these children. For now, that's basically all we have regarding the most recent lawsuit. We hope it gets resolved in a way that's favorable for the youth." In addition, after the whole case was made public, the Turpin siblings received a large amount of money from donations made by people to help them financially cope with the expenses they may have as a result of the aftermath of the abuses they suffered. Things like medical expenses, costs for psychologists, and that sort of thing, but also for use when they needed it. But Jordan has said in more than one interview that none of them could access this money and that it's frozen in accounts of organizations that don't allow them to use it. As for Jordan, she managed to escape from the house of horrors in which she lived and warned the police about what was happening. She suffered all the stress you can imagine and now lives in a fairly public way, but also appears to be happy. She has decided that instead of trying to hide in anonymity and try to keep a low profile, she would speak out about her situation. And she even opened a TikTok account that you can also follow, which is Jordan Turpin. She talks, shares details about her life, her day, and what she's doing, and sometimes she just dances. Experimenting, things that for us are very normal, but for her were absolutely and strictly forbidden. She can also be seen with a significant image change, having dyed her hair blonde, and even wearing makeup, things that were also forbidden to her. Small detail also that you might want to know. Do you remember I said that Jordan was a big fan of Justin Bieber? Well, the singer Justin Bieber gave her and her siblings tickets to go see him in concert. Apart from this, Jordan has also managed to live in her own apartment, something that for a long time did not seem possible or real to her. And that's what we have on the case so far, from what the siblings had to go through to what they're going through today. So they still don't have a fair break and proper rehabilitation. Let's hope that in the coming years they can finally establish somewhat more normal lives. They clearly suffered too much. It's not easy to adapt to society once you've lived so many years in constant abuse, and on top of that, isolated from the world. But well, let's hope that it can finally be achieved and that they truly receive the support they need. Well, that's where we end the video with all the information we have for today. Here are the Patreons and channel members. Thank you for supporting me through these means. With nothing else to add, here's a new video and a recommended one. Subscribe by clicking on my face. See you in another video. Goodbye!